Hey there, Sebastian here. Today I'm going to show you my top 3 tips for mixing metal snare. But before we dive in, if you're a metal guitar player looking to learn how to produce your own music, be sure to check out my online course, which is designed specifically for metal guitar players who want to take their production skills to the next level. All right, now let's go ahead and get started with tip number 1. Tip number 1 is to use compression and EQ together, but specifically to EQ into your compression. By doing this, you can boost more, as the compression will act as a compensation or a compensator, I guess, for large amounts of boosting that I typically do on snare. Now, I do want to point out, like I said in my last video, don't be shy with boosting a shitload of stuff on your snare drum, specifically like the high end part. I tend to do 12 to 15 dB boosts sometimes, but that can get a little hairy. And by EQing into my compression, those high frequencies actually trigger my compressor first. So the compressor kind of acts as this smoothing effect because it's being triggered more by the high end than like the body of the snare. But I do tend to boost some low end sometimes as well. So when it comes to the compression settings, however, I tend to use a very slow attack and a very fast release to emphasize the punch of the snare. So the slow attack is going to let the transient punch through, and the fast release is going to keep the body of the snare relatively the same. So it's going to sound like the snare is being hit harder than it really is when you have a slow attack and a fast release. So here's an example. Same as the last video I did, 7.5K, 12 dB boost. I'm boosting 2.5K at almost 5 dB. And I'm boosting 200 at 5 dB. And I'm going to take off the compressor, and I want you to hear this snare. And when I turn on the compressor, I want you to hear how it sounds like the illusion is that it's being hit harder, but also it's kind of rounding off the high end. So I'm going to show you before and after. Here is the snare with the EQ going into the compressor. So here's what it sounds like before. And here's what it sounds like with the EQ and the compression. So now I'm going to switch the order of the EQ and the compression. So here is the EQ going into the compressor. And then here's the EQ after the compressor. And I want you to pay attention to the high end. Now, at the last couple seconds there, I was switching between back and forth. I'll do it again, but if you had really astute ears, you'll hear that when I switch the EQ before the compressor, the high end kind of gets rounded off in a cool way. I like to EQ into my compression for my snare mics. Moving on to tip number 2. The second tip is to use saturation and distortion on your snare drum. This is going to help with controlling peaks, and it's also going to give the illusion that it's going to be louder than it really is. Snare peaks are notoriously hard to control. It's something I struggled with immensely in my beginnings. My snare would be peaking and pissing all over every bus that I had. My drum bus would be peaking. My mix bus especially is what would really annoy me, because the snare, every time it would hit, it would clip my master bus, and I never knew how to get around it until I realized that using saturation and distortion helps control that. Snare peaks are hard to control, and just by using EQ and compression, sometimes that isn't enough to help it also cut through the mix. So using saturation, it's going to add some harmonic distortion to the snare, and it's going to control the peaks, and it's also going to make it seem louder than it actually is. Here's a saturation plugin that I'm using. It's called Escalator by Black Salt Audio. And I want you to pay attention to when I turn this off and on, especially on this meter here. So here's it off. See, on certain hits it's jumping up almost 6 dB, right? But if I engage this, it's pretty much the exact same volume, but now the peaks are being controlled. And now I don't have to worry about them clipping any of my buses. So it's a really cool way to use saturation and distortion. So tip number 2 is to use distortion and saturation on your snare drum to control peaks. And our final tip, tip number 3, is going to piggyback off tip number 2, and that's clipping. It's slightly different than saturation, but the third tip is to use clipping to control peaks as well, similar to saturation, but this is a lot more aggressive. Clipping actually shaves off entire peaks, while saturation just kind of rounds them off. And I personally use both. Since the other plugin has both a clipper and saturation built in, I only need to use that plugin. But before, I would use a saturator and then this plugin called the clipper to mimic that same effect. And I use clipping as a safety measure, so it's not clipping any of my drum buses or my master buses. So here's an example, and I want you guys to pay attention to this area right here. Okay, that's prior to clipping. It's going past the -12 mark. Now, if I engage this, it's going to sound the same. It's not going to sound like it's any different, but you're going to see that the meter is now not going past 12. If you notice on this meter, you see it jumping past the 12. Well, that's what's letting you know what's actually being clipped off. So all those peaks that you saw in the light blue were being clipped by this particular plugin. Again, I like to use clipping as a subtle thing to shave off peaks and not introduce any harmonics or distortion. But the cool thing about this plugin is kind of the inverse of the last plugin. It lets you introduce harmonic distortion if you so choose with this little knob here. So you can kind of get the inverse effect of the last plugin where it's saturation then clipping. This is clipping and then saturation is added afterwards. Super cool plugins, both of those are. So those are my top 3 tips for mixing metal snare. And if you found this video helpful, please consider liking and subscribing to my channel for more content like this. Also, I'd appreciate if you guys left a comment below so I can figure out what else you guys would like to see from me. Thanks so much. Peace.